Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Khaled Elgindy, director of MEI's program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli affairs, and I'm pleased to host this week's episode of Middle East Focus, which will look at the role that Islamophobia plays in our political and policy discourse here in the United States, particularly as it relates to the issue of Israel and Palestine. As a reminder, you can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. Since the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's subsequent war in Gaza, we've seen a dramatic spike in anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and anti-Palestinian attacks across the country, both at the discursive level and in terms of violent attacks on people or institutions who are Jewish, Palestinian, or Muslim, or those believed to belong to these groups. Less than a week after October 7th, we saw the brutal and tragic murder of a 6-year-old Palestinian-American boy in the suburbs outside of Chicago in an apparent hate crime. Then, just a few weeks later, over the Thanksgiving holiday, there was the incident in Vermont when a group of 3 Palestinian-American college students, all of whom were wearing traditional Palestinian scarves called keffiyehs, were shot by a man in another apparent hate crime. There have also been attacks on Jewish temples and synagogues and other identifiably Jewish objects. Of course, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, including the violent variety, have existed well before October 7th. But there's no doubt we've seen a marked increase since then. But while there's been general acknowledgement of this trend, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and anti-Palestinian sentiments and attacks have not necessarily been afforded the same treatment. After the October 7th attacks, governmental, educational, corporate, and civil society institutions all across the country and at all levels issued statements of one variety or another that to many folks seemed heavily skewed toward one side, both in terms of who and what earned their condemnation or sympathy, and in terms of how or whether they responded to the racist backlash. In particular, whereas anti-Semitism has been widely and universally condemned, these same institutions were much slower to acknowledge Islamophobia, if they did so at all, and rarely, if ever, acknowledge anti-Palestinian sentiment, which had reached a fever pitch on social media, mainstream media, and even inside the halls of power. Today, we're going to look at the underlying issues of why this is the case. I'm joined today by Sahar Aziz and Mitchell Plitnick, who are the authors of an important and timely new study entitled Presumptively Antisemitic, Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, published last month by the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers University Law School. Sahar Aziz is the founding director of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, as well as Distinguished Professor of Law and Chancellor's Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers University Law School. She's the author of the 2021 book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, published by University of California Press, which I strongly recommend. Mitchell Plitnick is the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and a frequent writer on the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy. He is also the co-author with Mark Lamont Hill of another 2021 book that I highly recommend called Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, published by the New Press. So welcome, Sahar and Mitchell. Sahar, I'd like to go ahead and start with you. The topic of your study is, of course, extremely timely given the fallout from the events in Israel and Palestine since October 7th. And yet you undertook this study well before that. Tell us what prompted you to look at this question. But as you do, I'd like you also to tell us about your main argument. Your central argument, as I understand it, is that Islamophobia is a primary, though not necessarily the sole, driver and shaper of both U.S. policy and the public and political discourse on Palestine and Israel in the United States. What did you mean by this, and how is this the case?
Thank you so much for having me, Khaled. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you and with Mitchell. Well, as you noted, the report has been in process for over a year. We've been researching and writing for multiple months because we were experiencing, either our students, our faculty, myself included, who are Muslim and Arab, we were experiencing these attempts to censor us each time we wanted to engage in political discussions about Palestine and Israel. And we found that rather than disagree on the merits by those who effectively disagreed with us, they would accuse us of being anti-Semitic. They would accuse us of having hateful motivations for our critiques of Israeli human rights practices, or our critiques of the means by which the Israeli military was undergoing its occupation of Palestinians in the West Bank, the means in which Israel was fully blockading 2.3 million civilian Palestinians in Gaza and denying them adequate water, food, medical care, and so on. And we realized that this seems to be a trend. It's an attempt to censor people who are Muslim and Arab from engaging in this very important national conversation. And it's important because our country, the United States, has been providing Israel with $3.8 billion in primarily military aid, coming out to, I think, a total of over $250 billion since the establishment of Israel. And just now, President Biden wants Congress to approve another $14 billion that will directly fund the Israeli military as it engages in what I believe are war crimes in Gaza. So we realized we needed to address this issue because it hurts both the quality of our foreign policy discussions by excluding categorically an entire group of people simply because of their religious or ethnic identity. But equally important, it was perpetuating Islamophobia. It was perpetuating this very dangerous trope that Muslims are raised to hate Jews, which is false. That Islam teaches Muslims to hate Jews, which is false. And that this was also creating problems between Jewish and Muslim communities trying to actually be allies on social justice issues, on combating both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, combating the discrimination against religious minorities. So this report is our attempt to try to educate the public and policymakers and other members of the public who want to understand that, you know, each time Islamophobic tropes of anti-Semitism are perpetuated, that they need to at least understand there may be some really bad faith motivations behind those allegations that in fact are unfounded.
Mitchell, I want to ask you to help us dig in a little bit deeper on the relationship between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. You write, quote, Islamophobia is juxtaposed against anti-Semitism, portraying Muslims globally and domestically as agents of anti-Semitism, attempting to create a competition or even a zero-sum scenario between Muslims and Jews. You also argue that anti-Semitism is overemphasized and even overdefined, in that it includes things that go well beyond actual anti-Jewish bigotry to include things that encompass speech that would be critical of Zionism in Israel, as we just heard from Sahar. While Islamophobia is either underemphasized or deployed subtly to deny Palestinian rights and even humanity. I'd like to ask you, could you unpack this for us? Does this mean that it's impossible to fight anti-Semitism and Islamophobia at the same time?
No, actually, I think we're arguing, and I would certainly argue quite the opposite. First of all, let me also thank you for having us, and it is also great to be here with you and with Sahar. I think it's pretty clear, and we saw a perfect example of it yesterday, that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia have to be fought together. The power in any anti-racist movement is solidarity among different groups. And I do also believe that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, those fights need to be part of a broader anti-racist strategy. But when we're talking about Israel, Palestine, and Jews and Muslims come together and raise a united voice, it's very powerful and it shakes people up. We saw this yesterday at a demonstration in Washington calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. We saw Jewish leaders, we saw Muslim leaders getting arrested together as they tried to convince our government to take some positive action and seize the negative actions that it's taking. Look, the issue of whether or not you can point to an individual Muslim or an individual Jew and say they are either Islamophobic or anti-Semitic, I mean, of course, you can find such people in any communities. There are always people who are bigoted, who have had negative experiences that they have projected out onto entire groups. This is how racism comes to exist. But what we see here is a policy that we generally identify as pro-Israel. So there is a sort of a philo-Semitism that in many ways is motivated by actual dislike of Jews. But that aside, it's expressed as support for Israel. And that policy is one side of a coin that is backed up. The reverse side is policy that dehumanizes and minimizes the value of Muslim, Arab, and in this case, specifically Palestinian life. That is, I think, how you get a sort of discourse that supports the kind of policies that we've pursued and that we're pursuing in extreme fashion right now, as we see in Gaza and also, by the way, in the West Bank. The basis of our actions today, the reason that so many people support, it's not a majority of Americans according to the polls, but there are certainly a lot of Americans that support Israel's actions in Gaza. The way that happens is that the attacks on October 7th, which were horrific and criminal and terrible, they're also argued to be attacks on Jews as Jews. They are argued to be anti-Semitic attacks. When we portray them, when we portray Palestinian resistance, even when that resistance goes into horrible acts that are clearly against international law and clearly unacceptable and murderous, they are still resistance. And, as I've written in a recent article in another location, not one person was killed or kidnapped on October 7th because they were Jewish. It was because they were either actually or perceived to be Israeli. And there's a difference there because one of those things is motivated by anti-Semitism. The other is motivated by 75 years of dispossession, occupation, and the denial of rights. So it is crucial to portray Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims, these three different levels and sizes of communities, as inherently anti-Semitic because that justifies the kinds of policies that we're enacting.
Thanks. Sahar, I'd like to ask you about the findings in your report in the context of October 7th and everything that's happened since then. So obviously, none of this is theoretical. As you know from the dynamics on your own campus, Rutgers University is one of several universities that have banned groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, also known as SJP, on the basis that they're somehow promoting anti-Semitism. Tell us about how that came about, how it played out on your campus, what the responses have been, and what it means given the findings of your study. And if I could maybe attach to that, since a lot of the protests and SJPs and other places that we're seeing are not exclusively Arab and Muslim students, right? There's a large number of African American or white or other ethnicities. And so how does that fit in with your report thesis as well?
Well, there are two phenomena happening at the same time. The first is highly preferential treatment that is self-professed by politicians, by university administrators, by policymakers, and others who have formal means of power. And that preference, and some would call it an outright bias, is in favor of Zionism, in favor of people and organizations that support Zionism, particularly a right-wing version of political Zionism. And that has caused universities to enforce policies or develop new policies that favor these largely external Zionist groups' preferences and demands. And some of them are organizations, nonprofit organizations, some of them political action committees, some of them are donors or alumni that are also donors. And on the other hand, you also have a complete marginalization, discrediting, dismissal of people who are Muslim, Arab, South Asian as part of the post 9/11 Islamophobia trend, which has been very well documented, including, as you mentioned in my book, The Racial Muslim When Racism Questions Religious Freedom, but also by numerous nonprofit organizations from the ACLU to the Center for Constitutional Rights, to Human Rights Watch, to Amnesty International, to even to the United Nations, that Islamophobia is a serious, systematic form of racism and bias in the United States, as well as other Western countries. So when you put those two phenomena together, you have this toxic, I think, environment, toxic insofar as it quashes speech, it quashes college activism and student activism, it censors views that people who are pro-Zionist or supportive of Zionists believe in. And therefore, what we're doing is we're creating these universities that are spaces for censorship rather than spaces for thought and debate and protest and sit-ins and teach-ins, which is a very American tradition. If you think about the civil rights era, the Vietnam War, the women's rights movement, all of these significant social changes for the common good, many of them are rooted in college activism and arise from young people who dream of a better future, a different future that they believe is not as repressive against minority groups or women or other segments of the population. So when you quash that type of political activism and speech, you take America further down the path towards authoritarian regimes. And you and I, Khaled, we study authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, so we're very familiar with how authoritarian leaders direct their repression at universities, because they know that college students are the most likely generation to want change against usually repressive practices or policies. So what we see at Rutgers, unfortunately, and I'm embarrassed to say that as a professor at Rutgers, that our administration has effectively weaponized policies to suspend the Students for Justice in Palestine as part of a broader trend where you see it at Columbia, you see it at NYU, there are many other Brandeis University where they're suspending or outright banning the Students for Justice in Palestine. And while, yes, some of the members, the student members are in fact non-Palestinian, non-Arab, non-Muslim, the name of the organization is what makes it so easy for universities to do this without any accountability. Imagine if they had treated Hillel or Chabad or any largely Jewish student organization the way that they were treating Students for Justice in Palestine. There would be an outroar. There would be congressional hearings about it. There would be presidents getting fired over it. But instead, we're seeing the complete opposite, where presidents are fired because they are upholding free speech. They're upholding the right to engage in political assembly for students on their campuses. And any president who doesn't do that, any president who dares to defend, again, the rights of Palestinians and their allies, finds themselves under threat of being defunded for their university. So the other problem we need to be thinking about very seriously, which is not just related to the Palestine-Israel issue, is the commercialization of universities and how presidents are effectively CEOs for donors and for board of governors who are also donors, and that students are the absolute last priority. They don't seem to be thinking about their role, their fiduciary responsibility to create an environment where students can disagree, they can debate. Obviously, it needs to be civil, nonviolent, but sometimes it is controversial. Sometimes it does make people uncomfortable. How are you ever going to get out of your intellectual comfort zone if you're not exposed to different ideas that you may not agree with? And as long as the disagreements are based on the merits, based on the facts, then they should be permitted. So again, it's a serious problem for democracy in America, what we're seeing. It's also a serious problem for higher education and the quality of higher education. And the fact that it is Students for Justice in Palestine or Muslim students that is the face and the name of the repression or the targets of repression makes it all the more easier and makes the public accept it, just like they did after 9/11, when our national security policies and practices and our laws were changed to strip us of civil liberties and civil rights, a la the Patriot Act. And most Americans accepted it because they thought, well, that's so that we can restrain these dangerous Muslims. That's so that we can protect ourselves from them. And it's the same us versus them, outsider, insider mentality. But this time, the face of it are Palestinians, which are incorrectly presumed to all be Muslim, which we know there's a significant Christian population. But as long as the face is Muslim or Arab, then the public is giving up its constitutional rights and its civil liberties. And I think that puts all Americans at peril over the long run.
I want to pick up on this theme with you, Mitchell, of quashing speech and censorship. A few weeks ago, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American in Congress, was formally censured by her colleagues for saying, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which is a standard chant that we've heard among Palestinians for many years, and which her accusers said was tantamount to calling for the destruction of the state of Israel, even though that's not necessarily how Palestinians themselves understand that phrase. But regardless, many of her colleagues, in fact, a majority of her colleagues in Congress, voted to censure her, even when many of her colleagues in the House and the Senate had made openly racist and even genocidal statements about Palestinians, for example, calling for the flattening of Gaza or leveling the place. We even heard one Republican House member question the very notion that there was even such a thing as innocent Palestinian civilians. And yet none of them faced any kind of censure or even an attempt at that. So what does that say about our political culture in this country and about the power dynamics of how our politics work?
Couple of things here. First, you mentioned the issue of the phrase "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." There's also the word intifada that is, frequently used. It's an Arabic word meaning shaking off, that is colloquially referring to uprisings against oppression. And this also connects to the previous discussion about the situations on campus, because I think it's important to remember when we're addressing this, that when we're talking about the Jewish students on campus who are complaining that they feel threatened, that they feel uncomfortable, well, that's real, but it's also manufactured. It arises from those students being young people who have been told over and over and over again, since probably for many of them since they were very young, small children, that phrases like "from the river to the sea" or the word intifada, that these are calls for genocide against Jews. This is sold, again, on the basis of the presumption of anti-Semitism. And it is very hard for people to understand. Once they've become convinced that these are codes for genocide against Jews, it's very hard then to convince them that they are nothing of the kind. And it is, of course, that we see this power dynamic entering in, because it is not the people who are actually saying these words that get to define them, but rather powerful forces in our own society that are supporting, again, the dehumanization of Palestinians and the elevation of Israelis to a position where they can do to Palestinians whatever they see fit, that ends up defining these terms for these students. So I think it's important to recognize that these Jewish students aren't lying, or they're not part of some vast, ridiculous conspiracy. There's a genuine fear there. They actually feel that their lives are being threatened because they have been told over and over and over again that that's what these phrases mean. And we see the same thing playing out in the House. Rashida Tlaib has used the "from the river to the sea" language. This was the fundamental basis of her censure. And when we talk about censure, it's important to put that in perspective. Rashida was only the 6th member of the House in the entire history of the House of Representatives, well over 2 centuries, only the 6th member to be officially censured, and 3 of the others were censured for supporting the Confederacy. So when you eliminate those 3, you only have 2 others. So we're talking about a very serious slant here in terms of language and how we use that language, how we employ it towards Palestinians versus how we employ it towards supporters of Israel. As you mentioned, Brian Mast stood up in the halls of Congress and compared Palestinians to Nazis, not Hamas. And I want to be very clear. He was quite specific. He was not comparing Hamas to Nazis. He was comparing Palestinians. And it was that whole point that there are no innocent Palestinians. And let's remember, when he says this, he is echoing President Herzog of Israel, who said something very similar. And remember that Herzog is not from the Likud. He's not from the Jewish Power Party, Otzma Yehudit. He is supposedly a liberal. He was the guy who ran at the head of the labor coalition to try and unseat Netanyahu from the quote unquote left in Israel. So this is carrying over here into very powerful corners of Washington and our broader discourse and discussion. And again, it comes back to what I said earlier. The idea is to push the notion that when Palestinians are resisting in any way, when they're even just complaining about Israel, they're doing it not out of a desire for freedom or a desire for their rights, but strictly out of anti-Semitism. Back to the offensive, frankly, phrase that Golda Meir once used, that there will be peace when Palestinians love their children more than they hate us. This is all of a piece. It's all a single sort of thread that runs through the history of the discourse on Israel and Palestine in the United States. And it is based, again, on a vision of Muslims as inherently violent. And it applies that Islamophobia to all Arabs, whether they're Muslim or not. It comes back to, sort of a brown-skinned people concept of violence. But it is all here to justify Israeli brutality, which is the only way that they can maintain their position of dominance over Palestinians.
So, Sahar, I want to ask you about the relationship between Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, which we sort of touched on. Are these one and the same, or how are they different? Are there elements of bigotry that are unique to and directed at Palestinians as Palestinians, or is it all part of the Islamophobia category?
But when you analyze types of biases in America, you have to understand race and how race is socially constructed to be the master category in which privileges and material benefits, harms, and discrimination occur, usually within a hierarchical structure. And whiteness, however it's socially constructed, is the most privileged group, whereas Blackness is the least privileged or the most discriminated against and harmed group. And effectively what is happening is Muslims, especially since 9/11, but I actually argue in my book, The Racial Muslim, before 9/11 it started, where Muslims are now being racialized as these terrorist others, as dangerous, illiberal, misogynistic, anti-American, and effectively outsiders that should be expelled and excluded. And in fact, Trump specifically did so through his executive order, the very first one that he issued in January of 2017, once he became president. And so what you have is Muslims at the bottom of this racial hierarchy, where they're experiencing many of the harms that African Americans have long experienced as while they were enslaved and while they were in the legacies of slavery we still see today. And we also see it with Native Americans who were nearly exterminated from the United States. And that's why the U.S. is known by many scholars as a settler colonial society that did, in fact, commit a genocide against Native Americans. So once you understand that kind of reality of how different minority groups are treated, and Jews fit in, and Catholics and other minority groups, although Catholics now have become whitened, so to speak, and so have Jews that are of European origin. And I talk about that in the book. But Muslims and Arabs have actually been demoted. And much of that is because of international politics and geopolitics, the war on terror. But even before 9/11, the quintessential terrorist trope was actually Palestinian as far back as the 1970s. And much of that was as a result of very intentional media work and media portrayals of Palestinians as these dangerous, irrational terrorists that can never be negotiated with. They don't want peace. They hate Jews. They're hateful people. And so that has been deeply instilled in the American culture, again, since the 1970s, as a result of the increasingly pro-Zionist political agenda of our politicians and the way that our education system centers, right, these very Zionist experiences. So they are different insofar as Islamophobia is based on the portrayal of Muslims as terrorists and anti-Palestinian racism is the portrayal of Palestinians, but they're conflated because most Americans don't know the difference. Part of Islamophobia is that anybody who is perceived to be Muslim is effectively subjected to Islamophobia. And anti-Palestinian racism is a subset of that. I also want to know that if you notice all of the conversations in Congress, at universities, in the media, it centers Jewish Zionist experiences, and it does not even acknowledge sometimes the Palestinian experience. And that is a form of racism. So it's not, for example, well, let's listen to what these diverse populations of Jews in America, some of whom are Zionists and some of whom are anti-Zionists, let's listen to their perspectives and let's consider that in our analysis. But let's also listen to the Palestinians' perspectives, and they're also a diverse group of people. And then let's think about this very complex issue. No, it all starts with what do Zionist Jews want, think, and feel? And from there, we're going to develop laws, we're going to develop policies, we're going to censor the only and first Palestinian American woman elected official. We're going to shut down Students for Justice in Palestine. And who has to pay the price of this centering of one very specific experience within the broad, diverse Jewish American population? Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, and collaterally their allies. And that is racism in practice. That's how racism works. Just switch it with gender and you'll see the same thing, and it'll be sexism, where you center the experiences, preferences, and privileges of men over women. And that effectively is what this report is trying to do, is to expose that and say, we need to think about what kind of society we want. We need to acknowledge that the way that we are responding to this activism on campus, the activism in public squares, and the complete bias in the media and Congress is itself a form of racism, a manifestation of it. And is that really the type of society we want? And if so, well, you're setting a very dangerous precedent, because all you have to do is switch a different minority group, because it becomes the norm that the majority group can always dominate, oppress, and censor, and that becomes the American way of life. And I certainly hope that the majority of Americans do not agree with that practice.
Mitchell, I want to come back to you and ask, we've talked about how Islamophobia shapes the discourse or the ways in which American policymakers, journalists, and others talk about Palestine and Israel. To what extent does Islamophobia also explain U.S. policy and not just how we talk about it? For example, the Biden administration's approach toward the current Israeli war on Gaza.
Yeah, I think sadly, very sadly and frustratingly, Joe Biden is demonstrating the worst of everything we talk about in our report. He demonstrated this, I think, from the outset with a sort of knee-jerk reaction. Traditionally, American administrations have always been very supportive of Israel, very pro-Israel, but there's always been a certain point where they act to restrain Israel from its most extreme actions. We've seen even Donald Trump, when Israel was threatening to annex the West Bank, Donald Trump even said, hey, don't do that, and kind of pulled them back from that idea. Of course, that was in order to enact the Abraham Accords, and that's a whole other story. But there is that aspect to American administrations that it's minimal compared to the massive support, but it's been an important aspect over the years. Biden completely abandoned this and reacted in the moment after October 7 by completely encouraging the worst impulses of Israel, saying they have every right to do whatever they want, basically, to Gaza. And in fact, lying so blatantly to the press, to the American people, to the world, while we're all watching Israel targeting civilians, bombing the roads from the north to the south that they are telling civilians to take, bombing the shelters they are directing civilians to go to. We're actually able to watch this live on social media or regular media, and they're telling us that Israel is acting within the rules of war when we're seeing them commit the gravest violations. another very prime example. Biden repeated Israeli propaganda that was later shown to be false about for some reason, they decided to embellish the atrocities that happened on October 7th. I'm not sure why, because the actions themselves were more than bad enough without embellishment. But Biden repeated them and has continued to repeat them, even though even Israel has backed away from some of these. Biden questioned the figures that have been relied on for many, many years from the Gazan Ministry of Health, while not even blinking at the fact that Israel has several times now downgraded the number of people killed and has elided the fact that over 300 of the people who were killed on October 7th. And again, none of this excuses Hamas's actions, but they've elided the fact that several hundred of the people killed on October 7th were soldiers or security personnel who are legitimate targets. So we're seeing, just in the clearest possible way, the utter dehumanization of the Palestinians by Biden. And let's also recall, it didn't just start on October 7th. The policy of the Biden administration from the beginning, from the time he took office in 2021, has been to try and bury the issue of Palestine, to ignore the suffering of the Palestinian people, and instead to broker deals between Israel and, for example, Saudi Arabia, the state he promised to make a pariah. And that threatened, of course, to take away one of the few pieces of leverage that Palestinians have. So how does this happen? Well, you can't do any of this if you see the Palestinians as human beings. So this is fundamentally what we're talking about. The dehumanization of Palestinians as the sort of other side of pro-Israel discourse, and the fundamental sense that when Palestinians act, whether within the bounds of international law or outside them, out of the oppression that they have suffered, that is anti-Semitism. It is not out of a desire for the realization of their rights.
Thanks for that. We're just about out of time, but before we wrap up, I want to ask you both. Obviously, we encourage everyone to read your report, and particularly those in public office. But I want to ask you to sum up, each of you, if you could, in a sentence or two. What are your main recommendations? What should policymakers be doing differently in order to address this issue? Let's start with you, Sahar.
Policymakers need to get out of the groupthink dynamic that has for decades caused American foreign policy to be misguided and harmful to American interests. It was on full display in the global war on terror, where we only had one FBI agent who spoke fluent Arabic, and we had very few people who even understood the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, when we had engaged in a military occupation and expended billions of dollars. And so in the Palestine-Israel conflict issue, whatever you want to call it, it is very clear that there is only one perspective that is being expressed, analyzed, adopted, and that is a very right-wing political Zionist perspective. And therefore, there are very few people, if any, among the civil bureaucracy, the civil servant class, along the Hill staffers, that actually understand the Palestinians' experiences, that actually can provide the facts, the analysis, the recommendations that will make Palestine and Israel more secure for all people, and that will provide self-determination for the Palestinians. The Jewish Israelis already have self-determination, and that will also ensure that America doesn't become more and more unpopular and detested in the Middle East and Central Asia, and frankly, across the world right now, because it is seen as the funder and the political patron of these genocidal practices in Gaza that is intentionally starving over 2.3 million Palestinians, intentionally denying them fuel and clean water, and systematically destroying their healthcare system. All of this is not in the interest of the United States. So I would hope that policymakers and universities will have more diversity in terms of expertise and people who know the language, the culture, who have traveled there, who have lived there, as part of the conversation and the analysis of these very complicated political issues.
And Mitchell.
I think one of the key recommendations that we make in the report is that the United States has to basically put an end to the Israel exception in policy. It has to adopt a human rights framework that Joe Biden promised when he was campaigning for office and that he has thoroughly abandoned once he actually assumed his position in the White House. We need to have a policy that elevates Palestinian rights to the same level with Israeli human rights as it should be. These rights need to be universal. They are not now. There is a clear preference for Israeli rights over Palestinian rights. And we can look at this in other conflicts in other places around the world. But double standards, fundamentally, if we don't care just even about the humanity and about the suffering that is happening to the Palestinian people, we should at least care about American interests in the world. The double standard that the United States and particularly the Biden administration has employed between Ukraine and Gaza is visible to everyone, and it is going to undermine U.S. credibility in a way that even Donald Trump could not for many, many years to come. So if people don't care about the basic humanity of Palestinians, they should at least care about U.S. interests, whatever it takes to eliminate this double standard, this favoritism, which is by definition anti-Palestinian tint to everything the United States does in this region, has got to stop. It is hurting everyone, Israelis and diaspora Jews included.
That's all the time we have, but I want to thank our guests, Sahar Aziz and Mitchell Plitnick, for joining us and for a really rich discussion. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their hard work in putting together today's episode. You can follow MEI on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Khaled Elgindy. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you back next time for another episode of Middle East Focus.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.